With the war in Ukraine still ongoing, and just seeing endless videos of both Ukrainian and Russian vehicles being destroyed, I began to wonder, just how much longer can the US and the West keep supplying Ukraine? I mean, the US alone is giving them an average of 100,000 artillery shells per month, while they typically don't even produce that many in an entire year. Also, how is it getting to Ukraine? And can Russia do anything to stop them? So I went down a rabbit hole of trying to find the routes they take. And I know a lot of people are going to get upset saying that I'm giving away locations, so each route that I found, I then searched them in Russian, all over Russian sites and social media to see if they've been identified. Most of them already have been. Not all though, so I won't discuss the ones that haven't. So nothing here is revealing or helping the Russian military. It's nothing they don't already know, but it's still a fascinating journey, and I've got some exclusive satellite imagery to go along with it. And just the sheer complexity of the logistics involved is incredible. But while looking at Russian sites, and honestly any nation's websites, you gotta be careful. I always use a virtual machine to protect my actual computer from viruses and malware, along with a VPN, specifically NordVPN, who I partner with. And because of that, they have a great deal for my viewers. Go over to nordvpn.com/covert to check them out. You'll get 4 free months on a 2-year plan. But they make it incredibly easy to protect yourself online too. Even if it's just for gaming, watching content that's geo-restricted, or the real nerdy stuff like me where the Russian Ministry of Defense website is blocked. I personally found NordVPN extremely useful. And it's really easy to use. Connect with just a single click. They also have over 5,200 servers in 59 separate countries. They have the fastest speeds of any VPN out there, and you could use it on 6 different devices. Everything from Windows, Mac, Android, iOS, and many more. So again, go over and check them out at nordvpn.com/covert, and with that link, you'll get 4 free months on a 2-year plan. Also, most important is a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you buy it and you're not satisfied, you can get a full refund. So go and check them out. Again, NordVPN. So first, how does a military aid get to Ukraine? One main base, at least for the US, is Dover Air Force Base. It's on the East Coast, so closer to Europe, and part of the Air Mobility Command, which, as the name implies, its purpose is to transport military equipment by air. The vast majority of military aid is transported by air or via ship to Greece and then by air to Poland, specifically to an airport in Rzeszów, just 60 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. And as you can check for yourself, virtually any time, any day, there's an aircraft transporting equipment there. Traffic at the airport has increased dramatically. It's roughly 3 times as much since the start of the war, according to their own website. Partly because of this, warehouses around it have been popping up all over this year. Also, due to the importance, the US set up 2 Patriot air defense sites there, which made a lot of news at the time. And they're still there to this day. The interesting thing to me is that not all of them are pointed east as you might expect. Each one of the sites have some facing west. But from here, equipment is offloaded onto trucks, which you can see them lined up here. Then they're off to Ukraine. Some of it goes via rail, others have to be transported into Ukraine before going on rail. This complication comes from the size of the railroads. Most European countries use what is called the standard gauge, while Russia and other countries that were previously part of the Soviet Union use the Russian gauge. But right across the border, at Mostika, and I'm sorry but I know I'm pronouncing a lot of this probably horribly wrong, there's a gauge change, and also here there's been several new rail yards built. Here it can be loaded onto the so-called Russian gauge rails and then sent out across Ukraine. Ukraine's rail system is mostly electrified, not diesel. There's a few reasons for this. One is that electrified is less expensive per ton of freight hauled. Building the infrastructure costs more, but once it's finished, it's a lot cheaper. Another reason is that the Soviet Union, who built these, knew that in the event of a war, fuel would be needed for its military. And this benefits Ukraine today. Most of their rail system does not use up that valuable diesel fuel to transport supplies. However, obviously that means that it requires electricity to operate. There are numerous electric substations that power the trains throughout the country, and the loss of power at any one of these would severely limit the ability to transport military equipment across Ukraine. The question then becomes, why hasn't Russia struck them? And again, none of this is giving away any information to the Russians. These sites have been discussed and mapped going back to at least April that I found. But I still have not found a clear answer to that. I did find plenty of conspiracy theories, such as backdoor deals between the US and Russia on grain shipments, or sanctions, but no clear satisfactory reason. It seems as if Russia really thought that Ukraine would collapse early on in the war, and therefore striking infrastructure was pointless, as Russia would just have to pay to rebuild it. But a few months into the war, when it became clear that Ukraine wouldn't just surrender, again, no clear explanation as to why Russia hasn't struck them. But the recent strikes on Ukraine's power grid could be explained as a more strategic attempt to shut down Ukraine's rail network. But at this point, it really seems that Russia is more hoping that the US and the West will run out of equipment and munitions to send to Ukraine. So, will that happen? I figured one way of getting a good idea is with 155mm artillery shells. Throughout the war, the US and allies have sent over 800,000 155mm artillery shells to Ukraine. Now that number is likely higher as many countries did not disclose the exact figures. Also, this chart here is just when the packages were announced. The actual delivery dates aren't clear. But if we ignore February, in 8 months, that averages out to about 100,000 a month. Back in June, it was stated that Ukraine is firing about 5,000 to 6,000 rounds per day. Now that was all types of artillery, and you'd expect to have some losses, so 100,000 155mm shells per month seems to be a reasonable figure. The question then becomes, how long can the West continue sending that amount? According to budget documents, over the last 10 years, the US has budgeted production of about 75,000 on average per year. And again, that's per year, not month. So that means Ukraine is going through these shells at a rate 16 times faster than the US has been building them. Now, of course, production can be increased, but that takes time. Most explosive shells are assembled at the Iowa Army Ammunition Plant. In recent years, the most it's been able to produce is just under 200,000 in a single year. Just how many more they can produce beyond that is not clear. But even to produce that many, it had to reopen the older Line 3 20 years ago just to keep up with orders. The only other site that would load, assemble, and pack 155mm shells was the Milan Army Ammunition Plant, which was closed down recently. It's unlikely, but bringing that back into production at Line D at Milan could add another 100,000 shells per year, but again, even with that, it's well short of that 100,000 per month number. It's also worth noting that the total number of shells isn't the most important variable. One of the reasons for the large drop in recent years is due to the production of guided artillery shells. One guided shell, for example, could hit a target that would typically require 10 or more unguided ones to achieve, which means you would need 10 times or more less. But the cheap, unguided shells are mainly what are being sent, and they still need those to suppress the enemy. So, in the meantime, every delivery to Ukraine is dipping further and further into existing stockpiles. The exact number of shells kept in stock is secret. Now, I talked about it before, but the number kept is based on what is called the total army munitions requirement. This takes into account the estimations based on ongoing operations, homeland security, forecasting future threats and warfare, and the number needed to sustain operations for a period of time, munitions needed for at least 6 months of training, testing, and more. But based on this, a real rough estimate of 155mm shells the US has is 2 to 3 million. Now, the US alone has sent some 700,000 to Ukraine. And again, the US needs to keep some of its stockpile for itself, so it's likely reaching the limit of what it can send. Maybe another few months, but then that's it, which could explain why the US has been looking elsewhere recently. Reportedly, South Korea will be selling the US 100,000 shells, which will then be sent to Ukraine, but again, at current rates, this will only be enough for another month. And as Ukraine continues counteroffensives, it will require even more. So it seems virtually certain that Ukraine will run out in the not so distant future. And similar trends can be seen with GMLRS production for HIMARS. The US doesn't have a huge stockpile to continue giving Ukraine while still retaining enough for their own needs. One of the big ones that the US hasn't yet sent to Ukraine is ATACMS. Depending on the version, it would give Ukraine the ability to hit nearly every location occupied by Russia, including all of Crimea. Now, without getting into the political reasons of why they have not been sent, this one here is still tricky. The US has been working on a replacement, so they haven't been producing any ATACMS recently, and nearly all the ATACMS that have been built have now surpassed their 10-year service life. In 2016, they began a life extension modification to keep them functioning, and according to budget documents, 836 should have been completed by now. However, the program has been constantly falling behind schedule, and has had the total number that they're going to modify cut in half. So the actual number is somewhere between 459 to 836. Now, that may sound like a lot, but Russia is at least shooting down some percentage of GMLRS, again the missile associated with HIMARS, and the US has given well over 1,000 of those missiles. So while ATACMS would offer increased range, they really just don't have the numbers necessary to really make a big difference. And beyond those, there really isn't a whole lot more that the US or West can give Ukraine that it isn't already sending them. Tanks, such as Abrams, are extremely complex, requiring a huge amount of continuous maintenance as they practically have a jet engine. Aircraft would take well over a year to train the pilots and maintenance crews, and they would require a lot more additional training to really make maximum use of US jets. Longer range air defenses, like Patriot, the US doesn't really have a lot of extra ones just sitting around. And also, their real value comes from being integrated into a network of air defenses, radars, and interceptor aircraft. And in a way, that's the US military in general. Its real strength comes from integrating all weapons and platforms together. That makes the US incredibly powerful, but not great for providing military aid to other countries piecemeal. New makeshift weapons can be created, such as that Phoenix Ghost drone, and maybe some sort of their own Shahad 136 long-range loitering drone. Other Western air-launch weapons could potentially be adopted to work on Ukrainian aircraft, like HARM was. This could be things like SLAM, Harpoon, JASM, and so on, and these would all give Ukraine the ability to strike Russian targets deep into occupied territory. But beyond that, it's hard to see how the US and other Western countries in general can continue to keep up the rate of military aid to Ukraine that it has been, which again seems to be what Russia is counting on. But at the same time, Russia itself does not have an infinite supply of weapons either.